were Tony's first PhD student, right?
That's right.
And then did postdoc with a lot of us, and now is doing a lot of cool things. You tell us.
That's debatable. But so when I first heard about this event from Antonina, I was at once very excited to come and show my admiration for Toni, but also terrified to be addressing a computer science audience for the first time in 15 years. And I remembered something comforting, which is I was terrified 15 years ago as well. So it's no different. As I said, I don't get much time to think about theory stuff, but I am trying to pass it on to the next generation. These are my children, and they're reading a book that Toni could have written. It's called "Don't Let the Pigeon Use Formulas of Unbounded Depth." So I'd like to start by just giving a brief kind of timeline of my relationship with Toni. Hopefully it will elucidate some of her virtues. I grew up on the mean streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And naturally, in order to fulfill my academic ambitions, I packed my bags for Tucson, Arizona. And I actually went there because of Toni. Not that I knew much about her, I just knew she worked in theory of computation. And that sounded kind of catchy to me. I was obviously very self-involved when I first met her because I had an entire meeting with her without realizing she was very pregnant. And that was Miles, to show you how long ago that this was. So it came as a total shock to me when I saw her a few weeks later and she was carrying a baby. In my defense, I think this is partly due to Toni's kind of nonchalant attitude. She's not the type to let even very extraordinary circumstances prevent her from being present with those around her. And that's one of the things I really valued about working with her. It wasn't very long after that we started working together that Toni invited me to go to my first conference, which was Stock 1999 in Atlanta. And I hadn't done any real research yet or anything, and I didn't have the background to understand most of the talks. But that's another facet of Toni's brilliance, which is she includes you no matter what you're bringing to the party. Because it might just be the anchovy flavored Jello that turns out to be the hit. One of the things I was introduced to during this trip was Toni's circle of friends and close colleagues, which there were many, but just to show a few that I remember meeting at that time, some of whom are represented here today. Paul, Russell, Ron. One thing that became clear to me from the very first day of the conference, people really enjoyed working with Toni. People's faces would brighten when they saw her. And even a novice like me could piece together that this might have something to do with her willingness to engage on a meaningful level with everyone and her remarkable ability to do so. In time, I had the privilege of working with some of Toni's closest colleagues. And I found that they shared her passion, not only for the work, but for the human connection with people that they work with. This was also my first opportunity to have a fresh Krispy Kreme donut, which I highly recommend if you ever get the chance. So after about a year of working with Toni in Tucson, she told me that she and Rich were planning to move to the University of Toronto, where they had been grad students. And I was gearing up to fight my disappointment. But then Toni told me that maybe I could come with her and finish my studies there. And of course, I jumped at the chance. So not only because I was young and looking for adventure, but because I could keep working with Toni. And it was at Toronto that I met so many people who would influence both my studies and my life. some of whom are here, Antonina, Valentine, some of whom are not, Alan Ford and Steve Cook. Alistair, I think he's going to participate as well.
Alistair's online.
Great. It was also where I got to know Toni and her family a whole lot better. And she was not only generous with her time and her ideas, but she also kind of lets you in and makes you feel welcome no matter what the setting. So I actually learned a lot from visiting Toni and Rich's house, where they lived with their kids, Ella, Cole, and Miles. It was not always the neatest house. I remember being shocked one time after it got a professional makeover and it looked completely different. But it hummed with activity, and everything that needed to get done always did, despite 3 kids and 2 parents with very demanding professions. One of the things I think of when I think of Toni is her ability to take an infinitesimal quantum of time and quietude and to do something incredibly productive with it. And her brain never seemed to need any warm up. There were always ideas waiting to develop at any moment. And now that I'm a parent myself, I try to channel some of this ability, but only with varying levels of success. This picture kind of speaks for itself, but this was a typical day at the office. And so one of the other people who had a big influence on my life during my time in Toronto was this guy, Avner Magen. He came to Toronto as a postdoc about 2 years after I started my PhD there. And I have to say I was a little bit jealous of him. He was not only smarter than me, but also funnier, and that is unforgivable. And frankly, I was worried that Toni would like him better. As it turned out, she suggested that we all work together and identified exactly the right topic for us to make progress on, which is another skill she has. And that experience turned out to be some of the most satisfying work I've ever done. I remember feeling that the questions were completely inscrutable when we started, but somehow as we chipped away at it, utilizing the various areas of expertise among the people working on it, it became scrutable. And the amazing thing is I'm pretty sure Toni knew this would happen from the beginning. And that's one of the most important lessons I've learned from her. Even things that seem impossible at first can become tractable in some cases. In other cases, like circuit complexity, they can't. So Avner and I became close friends, and he served as sort of a second mentor for me. Of course, it was Tony's shoulder that I went to cry on when he left this world too soon. But back in 2004, things were going well, and I managed to make it through my PhD defense. But that very afternoon, a much more minor tragedy struck. I was rushing to move out of my apartment, and I borrowed Toni and Rich's minivan. I don't know if you guys remember this, but to get the job done. In my haste, I managed to scrape it along a brick wall. And needless to say, I never worked in this business again. No, in reality, Toni helped me to secure 2 very fulfilling postdocs, one with Russell. And now that I work in industry, there are few opportunities to reason abstractly, but it does come up once in a while. So I would feel a little bit remiss if I didn't include at least some technical content in this talk. But I want to start with the disclaimer: this is not novel research. It's more an application of well-known facts. But they're facts I learned mostly from Toni, so I think that should count for something. And moreover, I think the instinct to ask the underlying questions in a setting that's not necessarily open to that all the time is something I learned from Toni. So I wanted to show this and to show that her influence is extending to unexpected areas. So imagine you're tasked with providing important internet content, such as the 3rd season of The Mandalorian, to hungry viewers from across the world. You might need an infrastructure that looks something like this. You have your racks of servers in a data center. You've got a bunch of routers interconnected. And then you've got links to internet service providers. This is the one I use from home. So a deployment, so I should mention that this unit here is what we often refer to as a POP, a point of presence in the industry. And a deployment, it consists of many of these in many geographical locations. Within a given POP, each of these links to the different internet service providers can reach some segment of the internet with some overlap due to the tiered nature of internet service providers. And one thing I've learned from working in industry is that sometimes system design and that the kind of inertia that it implies can act as a computational constraint. So in this case, when a user makes a request for content, there's a global load balancer that decides which POP to send them to. And once assigned to a POP, there's a local load balancer that decides which of the ISP links we should use to reach that user. So the LLV's job, the local load balancer, is to find a valid flow when assigned a set of demands for the users. So here's a graph where you have the users or the clusters of users on the left, the providers on the right, and the capacities going to this final node. The global load balancer's job is to make sure it assigns a feasible set of demands to that POP, because there's not really an opportunity to send traffic away once it's already sent to the POP. So how does the global load balancer ensure this feasibility? Well, the min-cut max flow tells us that the constraints are really that for every subset of the user clusters, you want the sum of its demand to be less than or equal to the sum of the capacities of its neighbor set in this graph. But this is a lot of constraints, clearly. And the global load balancer can really only handle a small number. So in reality, in fact, this is a sad state of affairs, but the global load balancer is really only good at enforcing disjoint linear constraints with unit coefficients, but we won't be too strict about this for now. So the question that kind of arose, somebody actually asked this question organically in the company: can we summarize these constraints with a smaller set of constraints that ensure feasibility? And something in my mind just kind of sparked up to my former days of theory, and it seemed like no. But how much do we lose if we try to do that? So this is where the argument takes what I like to call a Toniann twist. So if I learned anything from Toni over the years of research, it's when you're trying to prove a lower bound, always try an expander graph. And so that's what we'll do here. We'll use a very strong expander that has, so this notation means that this is a bipartite graph. The nodes on the left have degree at most d, and subsets of the left of size at most delta n expand by a factor of at least d minus 1 minus epsilon to the neighbor set. So and we'll use unit capacities for the lengths here. So let's associate with each subset U prime in a point, which is in Rn. And that point will be the expansion factor of U prime. So in other words, the size of the neighbor set of U prime over the size of U prime is what this notation here means. If the coordinate is in U prime and 0 otherwise. So this point may or may not be in the valid flow polytope, but if it's not, then it's on the, if it is, then it's on the boundary because one of the constraints is tight. So if you just nudge it a little bit with epsilon, it'll be outside the polytope. So let's say, just for an example, you want to summarize the feasible solutions with 100 constraints. Our strategy to refute that is let's pick 200 disjoint subsets of U of size at most delta n over 2. One of the summary constraints must exclude at least 2 of these, what I call jostled points, the points you've added epsilon to. And so let's say those points are P and Q. That constraint is also going to exclude linear convex combinations of those points. So for each non-zero coordinate of this point, P plus Q over 2 is bounded by D plus epsilon over 2 because of the degree bound. But in contrast, let's consider another point, W, where the coordinates are D minus 1 minus epsilon if the coordinate is in U1 union U2. Did I say what U1 and U2 are? I think I skipped that. So U1 and U2 are 2 of these disjoint subsets of size at most delta n over 2. So and the coordinates of W are 0 otherwise. So because of expansion, W is a valid point in the flow polytope. And so we lose a factor of roughly 2 when we compare a point that's included, W, with a point that's not included, P plus Q over 2.
I'm missing, why is there a U1 and a U2?
So we were taking these two. So basically, we wanted to have these 2 points where there's some point in the middle that's a convex combination of them that's going to be included. That's going to be excluded. So generalizing a little bit, I think you can prove the following thing, which is that for any constancy, there's an epsilon such that if you try to summarize with 2 to the epsilon n constraints, there's going to be a point, there's going to be 2 of these points that have a similar property, x and y, where each coordinate of x is less than the corresponding coordinate of y. But if you take the ratio of their L1 norms, it's at least C. So I think it's a fairly strong statement that you're not going to do well summarizing these constraints. And I think the upshot is that maybe we shouldn't all watch The Mandalorian at once. So just before I conclude, I wanted to give Toni a little present. This is in mint condition. This is a fairly close model of the car that I like.
Finally.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Josh. Thank you for bringing the car into the picture.
It was the least I could do.
questions, comments.
So I.
It's not on.
That's gonna be a problem. 'Cause I'm the last one. No, I just have a question. So is this something that was surprising to people?
It's a good question. I would say probably not too surprising. I think it was just a kind of hopeful, wishful thinking maybe was the question. And it's not actually, there are more constraints involved so that we don't even have to consider that question. So we do much worse than that in general, the way we do it.
Oh, and I have one other question. Have you gone ice climbing?
What's that?
Have you gone ice climbing ever
No,
again?
no.
That's the story I thought.
I think, yeah, I think those days are behind me.
More questions? Actually, can I ask something weird? Looks like in your work you do use theory from way back when. Is it like?
I wouldn't call it part of my work. It's sort of a hobby that I can apply it once in a while, but it's not something that's, I wouldn't say it's integral to the company's, operating or anything like that. I wish it were.
It would be nice to convince them of that. So.
Yeah.
Okay, questions, comments, solutions to real world problems.
So how do you solve it?
So in reality, we don't actually decide. We don't really give ourselves a decision as to which provider we take. The routing is kind of, we use BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol, to tell us which provider each user will take. And so we sort of leave it up to the hands of fate instead of making an informed decision.
Sounds like a great algorithm.
It's a random walk. We do it.
Random
Yeah.
walk, yeah, we do it all the
So-
time. Okay, thank you so much. So now we have a couple of hours for lunch. Generally, people sort of cluster together in group and then wander off in the general directions and oftentimes find something edible. And we'll be back at 2:30 for more talks. Thank you so much, everybody.